Why did the message come at 400 hours, when the world was at its quietest, when the mind was most vulnerable to doubt? Colonel Rachel Hunter Blackwood stared at the encrypted transmission glowing against the darkness of her private quarters. The words were clear. A Russian sniper named Victor had called her world record amateur work. He wasn't whispering it in shadows or leaking it to tabloids. He was challenging her, directly, formally, under international observation. A duel of skill, precision, and pride. Rachel read it twice, then a third time, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. But no, the meaning stayed the same. Her hand hovered over the secure phone. She'd made countless battlefield calls before, air support requests, casualty reports, last words delivered to commanders in chaos. But this felt different. This was not combat, not survival. This was personal. Still, her instincts told her the same thing. Hesitation kills. She picked up the receiver. Moments later, the Pentagon was stirring awake. By 600, Rachel was seated in a windowless briefing room deep beneath Arlington. The walls hummed with old fluorescent light, the kind that never quite reached the corners. A projection screen glowed cold blue above the long oak table. Around her sat generals, intelligence officers, and technical specialists, men and women who usually treated her with clipped respect, sometimes with doubt, but never indifference. Director James Mitchell of the Defense Intelligence Agency slid a folder across the polished surface. "Colonel Blackwood," he said quietly, "what you're about to see, only 50 people in the world are cleared to know." Her fingers hesitated on the cover. Inside, she expected bureaucratic jargon. Instead, she found photographs, diagrams, and ballistic reports that made her stomach turn. The face stared up at her. Pale eyes, sharp Slavic features, lean build wrapped in Russian uniform. Surveillance images showed him in snowbound forests, rifles balanced against makeshift rests of frozen logs, targets shattered in ways the numbers barely explained. "Meet Victor," Mitchell said. "Call sign Ghost of Siberia, former, 31 years old." Rachel flipped to the ballistic sheets. Her throat tightened. The numbers didn't make sense. Confirmed kills at ranges over 3,800 meters, beyond doctrine, beyond human capacity. Shots no Western manual would even suggest attempting. Her record, the 3,247-meter hostage rescue that had made headlines, the one that had etched her name in military history, suddenly felt small. Amateur work, he had called it, and now she saw why. But something else rattled her more than the numbers. Notes in the margins of the reports. References to training methods, atmospheric compensation formulas, even Montana range calculations that she had believed were sealed behind layers of classification. "How does he know this?" she asked. Her voice cracked slightly, though she forced it steady. Mitchell leaned back. "We believe he studied you, extensively, your techniques, your patterns. Either he's developed similar methods independently, or there's been a breach." A chill traced down her spine. Breach. The word she feared more than failure. Someone somewhere might have leaked her playbook. "And now he's challenging me," she said flatly. "Yes," Mitchell answered. "Head to head, under international eyes. He's proposed 3 phases, known distance, unknown distance, and 1 attempt each at over 3,500 meters. His terms are ambitious." Rachel closed the folder and pressed her palms against it. For a long moment, the room was silent. She remembered her father's voice, back in Montana when she was still a girl struggling to steady a rifle that felt too heavy for her small shoulders. "You don't prove yourself by breaking records, Rachel. You prove yourself by showing up when you'd rather walk away." She hadn't walked away then, she couldn't now. Her voice was calm when it finally came. "Tell him I accept." The weeks that followed broke her body down to its smallest pieces. Training wasn't new to her. She had spent a career sharpening herself like a blade. But this was different. Every sunrise began with oxygen-starved runs under weighted packs, her lungs clawing for air while her mind rehearsed ballistic math. Afternoons belonged to the range, hours of shooting under shifting winds, every round tracked and logged until her shoulders ached and her eyes blurred from glass. Evenings ended with silence, where she forced herself to relive the failures more than the triumphs. Dr. Sarah Harrison, the military's top sports psychologist, had been assigned to her. She spoke softly, with the patience of someone used to peeling soldiers back from the brink. "Colonel, this won't just be about skill," she said. "It'll be about your head. He'll know you. He'll try to live rent-free in your mind before you ever fire a shot." Rachel only nodded. She understood. She had played that game too, once upon a time. In Afghanistan, in deserts where the wind shifted like a liar's tongue, she had broken enemy snipers not just with her rifle but with her silence. She knew what it was to become a ghost in someone else's fear. But now, someone was trying to ghost her. 3 weeks before departure, new intelligence arrived. It nearly stopped her heart. Wasn't a freelancer. He had belonged to a Russian unit specializing in extreme-range assassinations, black missions, unacknowledged even by their own command. His documented kills had struck high-value targets at distances beyond 4,000 meters. One report suggested he had killed a general while wind shear tore across a frozen valley, using conditions that should have made the shot impossible. And worse, he had studied her, not just her public record, her classified engagements. Somehow he had obtained combat footage, training data, techniques meant to be locked away in vaults. Rachel closed the file that night and pressed her palms into her eyes until stars burned across the darkness. It wasn't just about skill anymore. It wasn't just her pride or even America's reputation. This was a test of systems, of nations, of secrets. If she failed, it wouldn't be her name that fell. It would be every doctrine, every method her country had built. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was fractured. She dreamed of Montana again, her father's hand steadying her rifle, snow crunching beneath boots, the calm before the squeeze of a trigger. But always, just before she fired, another figure appeared across the ridge. Tall, faceless, pale-eyed, watching her. She woke before dawn with her pulse racing, lungs dragging for breath. By the time the plane lifted off for Switzerland, where the duel would be staged, Rachel felt hollowed out. Stronger, yes, but also stripped bare. She knew she had prepared her body and mind to the edge. And still, a small voice whispered, "What if it isn't enough?" As the jet engines roared, she pressed her forehead against the window, watching the Atlantic's endless black beneath them. Somewhere across that ocean, Victor was also preparing, perhaps sleeping peacefully, perhaps calculating wind drift in his head the way she was. For the first time in years, she admitted to herself she was afraid. And yet beneath the fear something burned brighter, not arrogance, not even pride. It was defiance. Because if Victor thought her record was amateur work, then he had no idea who Rachel Hunter Blackwood really was. Not yet. What kind of man arrives with the silence of a storm? Rachel found out the moment Victor stepped off the Russian transport plane onto the frosted tarmac of the Swiss Alpine Training Center. The air was thin, sharper than any she had breathed in Afghanistan or Montana. At 2,400 meters above sea level, oxygen seemed to leak from her lungs as quickly as it entered, leaving her with a constant dull ache in her chest. But as she adjusted, she noticed Victor didn't seem to struggle at all. His movements were steady, calculated, almost unnervingly calm. He was taller than she'd expected, 6'4", lean but not gaunt, the kind of build honed by years of moving in wilderness where survival depended on conserving strength. His pale blue eyes carried the same chill as the wind rolling off the Alps, and in that instant, Rachel realized something unsettling. She recognized him. Not the man, but the presence. That same quiet authority she had felt across a scope when facing the rare sniper who wasn't just competent, but exceptional. When they shook hands, his English came smooth, almost polished. "Colonel Blackwood," he said, bowing his head slightly. "Your reputation precedes you. It is an honor." Rachel matched his courtesy. "Mister, may the best marksman prevail." Their grips tightened fractionally, polite enough for the observers to miss the message, but unmistakable to each other. "I will not yield." The meeting was over in seconds, but its echoes clung to Rachel long after she walked away. That night in her barracks, she lay awake listening to the whistle of alpine winds against the tin roof. Her muscles ached from the day's acclimatization drills, her head throbbed from low oxygen, and yet her mind replayed Victor's expression. Courteous, professional, but beneath it confidence. Not arrogance, not bravado, something quieter. He believed he would win. The Swiss facility was a masterpiece of neutrality. Designed to train soldiers from across NATO and partner nations, it was built into the mountainside like a fortress married to the earth. Concrete halls tunneled into stone, while outdoor ranges stretched across valleys that funneled shifting winds like invisible rivers. The altitude changed everything. Bullets flew farther, but unpredictably, their arcs exaggerated by thin air and sudden gusts. Rachel arrived a week early to study it. Each morning she rose before the sun, hauling her system up steep trails until her lungs burned and her vision blurred. She spent hours lying prone on frozen, eyes pressed to glass, mapping how fog rolled, how gusts curved, how shadows changed visibility as the mountains turned gold beneath sunrise. Her notes filled pages, tiny observations, wind patterns shifting by half a degree, pressure drops so subtle most would ignore them. She knew she couldn't predict everything, but she could prepare her mind to expect the unexpected. Still, there were moments she doubted. She remembered crouching in her hut one night, pencil scratching equations by lamplight, when her hand froze mid-calculation. A thought cut through her focus like a blade. What if he's better? What if I've already lost, and all of this is just delaying the inevitable? Her jaw tightened. She hated that thought. She hated its honesty even more. Dr. Harrison's voice returned to her mind. "Fear doesn't mean weakness, Rachel. Fear means you're awake. It means this matters." She pushed the thought down, finished her notes, and packed her rifle for morning drills. 3 days before competition, the first official briefing was held in the main hall. International observers filled the rows, officers from NATO, neutral Swiss officials, Russian dignitaries with stiff postures and watchful eyes. Rachel sat at the long table across from Victor. Between them, a map of the valley and range markers glowed under fluorescent lights. "Phase 1 will commence at dawn," the Swiss adjudicator explained. "Known distances, 1,500, 2,000, and 2,500 meters. Accuracy will be measured electronically within a 2 mm margin. Standard conditions will be logged. No external assistance permitted." Rachel nodded silently. Her fingers drummed the table not out of nerves but focus. Numbers already spun through her mind. Drop rates, wind calls, corrections. Victor sat motionless, hands folded, gaze steady on the map as though the explanation bored him. But Rachel watched his eyes. He wasn't ignoring, he was. When the meeting adjourned, whispers followed her down the hall. She heard the tones, half admiration, half doubt. She had lived with them for years. A woman, a sniper, a record holder. But can she do it again? Outside, snow began to fall in delicate sheets across the valley. Rachel pulled her coat and walked the path back to her quarters. She stopped halfway, looking out over the white expanse where tomorrow's shots would be fired. For a moment, the enormity pressed against her ribs. This wasn't just about her. It was America's doctrine, its pride, its secrets. Her breath clouded in the alpine cold. She whispered to herself almost like a prayer, one shot at a time. The night before Phase 1, she slept less than 2 hours. Dreams bled into memories. Afghanistan dust storms, Montana snow drifts, the faces of hostages she'd saved, and the eyes of men she hadn't. She woke before her alarm, pulse heavy in her ears. By dawn, she was prone on the firing line. The mountains blazed gold beneath first light, snow glittering like shards of glass. International officials murmured behind her, their voices muffled by her headset. Rachel blocked them out. All that mattered was the scope, the target, the math. At 1,500 meters, she exhaled, squeezed. The round struck within an inch of dead center. A clean hit. At 2,000, she adjusted for wind shear rolling off the ridge. Another shot, another near-perfect impact. At 2,500, she felt the strain. Her calculations wavered as wind shifted in irregular bursts. She steadied, breathed, fired. The bullet landed just over 2 inches from bull's. Not perfect, but solid. Applause rippled faintly behind her. She didn't turn. Applause meant nothing, not yet. Then Victor took the line. He barely studied the wind. He didn't scrawl equations or adjust with visible calculation. He simply looked, leveled his rifle, and fired. 1,500, dead center. 2,000, half an inch from perfection. 2,500, so close that officials had to run measurements twice to confirm. The silence after his third shot felt heavier than thunder. Rachel's stomach twisted, not at his skill, but at how effortless he made it look. When the phase concluded, they walked past each other without speaking. But in the brief glance they shared, Rachel saw it again. Confidence. Not gloating, not mocking, just certainty. Back in her quarters, she dropped heavily onto her bunk, hands trembling despite the warmth of her gloves. She had performed brilliantly, and still she had been outshined. Fear prickled her skin, but deeper beneath it another feeling rose. Not despair, something sharper, defiance. Tomorrow would be phase 2, unknown distances. The part where human intuition mattered most, where formulas bent under pressure and instinct carried the weight. She sat forward, lacing her boots, whispering to the empty room. He thinks he knows me. He has no idea. How do you calculate the distance to a target you can barely see? That was the question echoing in Rachel's mind as phase 2 began. The Alpine sun had just crested the ridge, painting long shadows across the frozen valley. Cold bit into her fingers even through the gloves, the kind of chill that crept into bones and slowed everything. Reaction, thought, confidence. This phase would be different. No rangefinders. No preset distances. The officials had placed 3 targets in the valley between 2,500 and 3,500 meters. Each sniper would have to identify, estimate, calculate, and fire, all with nothing but skill and intuition. Rachel felt her pulse quicken as she lay prone on the mat, cheek pressed to the comb of her rifle. She exhaled slowly, forcing calm into her body. You've done this before, she reminded herself. Montana, Afghanistan, Syria. This isn't new, just colder, just quieter. She scanned the valley through her scope. The first target shimmered against the snow, barely a shape at this distance. She started working through the math in her head, building layers like scaffolding, angle of terrain, shadow length, the way the mirage bent around the silhouette. Her father's voice drifted back from childhood. Don't rush it. The mountain always tells you what you need to know if you're patient enough to listen. She listened, estimated, wrote the number silently in her head, adjusted windage, breathed, fired. The bullet cut across 2,847 meters of frozen air. The impact landed within acceptable margins, clean, though not perfect. Her hands trembled not from cold but from adrenaline. She forced herself steady. Target 2. She studied for minutes, measuring distance by the arc of the slope, the curve of snowdrifts, the way light refracted in the glass. Another calculation, another breath, another shot. 3,156 meters. Hit. Not dead center, but solid enough to make observers murmur with admiration. Target 3, the most difficult. She could feel her nerves unraveling with each second. The math strained her brain, wind shifting unpredictably as alpine currents tangled across the valley. Sweat beaded under her layers despite the cold. She adjusted again, and again, then pulled the trigger. The round stretched across 3,389 meters. It landed just off the core but still within scoring parameters. A respectable showing. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Applause rippled. She didn't smile. Respectable wasn't enough here. Now it was Victor's turn. He moved into position with the same fluid calm as before. He didn't pace, didn't mutter equations. His eyes swept the valley once, twice. Then he loaded his first round. Bang! The shot struck closer to dead center than hers had. Second shot, again near perfect. Third, even grouping. Observers leaned forward, whispering to each other in disbelief. Some even checked the electronic systems to confirm. Rachel's stomach dropped. It wasn't just that he was good. It was how fast, how confident. He barely studied, barely hesitated, as though he already knew the distances. Her hands clenched, that thought again, how? By the time Phase 2 ended, the officials were buzzing. Rachel had performed well, brilliantly by any normal standard. But Victor had outpaced her again, and this time it wasn't explainable by luck or even raw talent. As they walked past each other leaving the range, Victor gave the faintest nod, a gesture that might have been respect or quiet triumph. Rachel didn't return it. She kept her eyes forward, jaw tight. Back in her quarters, she shut the door harder than she meant to. The sound echoed through the small metal room. She stripped off her gloves and dropped heavily onto the bunk, her mind racing. She replayed every second of his shots, his lack of calculation, his certainty, the precision that bordered on impossible. It didn't add up. Unless... Her thoughts turned dark. Was he cheating? Did he have prior knowledge of the distances? Or worse, had someone fed him her own methods, her data? She pressed her palms into her eyes until stars danced behind her lids. Paranoia was poison, she knew that. But paranoia also kept people alive. The knock on her door startled her. Dr. Harrison stood in the hallway, her expression unreadable. "How are you holding up?" Rachel almost laughed. "He's not human, that's how I'm holding up." The psychologist stepped inside, closed the door softly. "You've seen soldiers break records before. Why is this different?" "Because he knew," Rachel snapped. "I could see it. He didn't measure, he didn't calculate, he just knew, like someone had already handed him the answers." Harrison studied her. "And what does that tell you?" "That I'm fighting more than him," Rachel whispered. "I'm fighting whoever's feeding him." The silence that followed was heavier than truth. By the third night in Switzerland, Rachel was unraveling. She walked the perimeter alone under pale moonlight, boots crunching over snow. She needed the cold to bite her, to wake her. She stared at the ridges, the targets hidden in shadows, and she wondered, what was the point of preparing if someone else already had her playbook? But then she remembered something. Her father again, younger days, wind roaring across a Montana ridge. The math gets you close, Rachel, but it's the gut that saves you. The shot doesn't come from numbers, it comes from here. He'd tapped her chest. Here, where the rifle listens. She stopped walking, hands trembling at her sides. She couldn't control what Victor knew. She couldn't undo whatever breach had happened. But she could control herself. She could control the shot. The next morning, she walked into the mess hall where both teams ate in silence. Officers, translators, dignitaries. It was a room full of tension disguised as formality. Victor sat at the far table, posture upright, movements precise even when stirring tea. Rachel didn't look away this time. She let him see her watching. For the first time since arriving, she didn't avert her eyes. And in that long, unbroken stare, she made herself a promise. Tomorrow, Phase 3, the ultimate shot, 3,847 meters, a distance beyond human doctrine, beyond sanity, one attempt, one chance. And if Victor thought she would flinch, he was wrong. Because she would not break. Not here, not now, not with the whole world watching. How far can a human being push a bullet through the sky before it stops being marksmanship and becomes faith? That question haunted Rachel as dawn broke over the Swiss Alps on the day of Phase 3. She woke before the alarm, heart already thundering in her chest. The barracks were silent, frost creeping across the window panes like veins of glass. She sat on the edge of her bunk, head in her hands, trying to slow her breathing. 4.8 seconds. That was how long the bullet would take to reach the target at 3,847 meters. 4.8 seconds of flight time. Long enough for wind to shift directions twice, for pressure to drop, for the Earth itself to rotate a fraction beneath the arc of lead. Numbers swirled in her mind, but they weren't enough. They could never be enough. She pulled on her gear methodically, as if routine could shield her from the weight of expectation pressing down like the mountain itself. Boots, jacket, gloves. The system, its case heavier than her body wanted to accept after weeks of training. She slung it across her shoulder, teeth clenched against the ache. In the mess hall, silence ruled. American officers sat stiff on one side, Russians on the other. The Swiss facilitators moved between them like referees in a match no one had agreed to call fair. Victor sat at the far end, hands folded neatly over a steaming cup of black tea. His eyes rose once, found hers, held them. No smirk, no bravado, just a steady, calm focus that carried its own weight. Rachel forced herself not to look away first. Minutes later, they marched out into the freezing dawn. The valley stretched below them, breathtaking in its stillness. Peaks glowed under early light, their shadows swallowing forests and where wind moved like unseen rivers. The target had already been set, a human-sized silhouette, nearly invisible against a snowfield, waiting 3.8 kilometers away. Officials spoke in clipped tones, rules were restated, one shot each, no second chances. Rachel felt the cold seep through her gloves as she unpacked the. She laid it down with reverence, every motion deliberate, every click of the bipod a ritual. Her hands shook only once when she slid the bolt open and chambered the round. She paused, let the tremor pass, then continued. "Breathe, Rachel, just breathe." She dropped prone, cheek pressed to the stock, eyes behind the scope. Through the glass, the target was little more than a ghost, shimmering faintly as alpine air distorted its edges. Her mind reached back unbidden to the first time she'd held a rifle. She was 12. The Montana winter had been brutal, wind cutting across their ranch like a knife. Her father had stood behind her, calloused hands adjusting her grip. "You're smaller than the rifle now, but one day the rifle will fit you like skin. Remember this, it's not about the weapon. It's about the stillness inside you." Stillness, she chased it now, even as adrenaline roared in her blood. She began the math. Bullet drop, nearly 650 inches. Effect, 4 inches east thanks to Earth's rotation. Wind drift, impossible to calculate perfectly, gusts between 4 and 7 miles per hour, shifting every few seconds. She layered corrections over corrections, the scope's reticle becoming less a tool than a conversation with chaos itself. She closed her eyes. In the darkness, she pictured the bullet's path, a long arc over mountains and snow, through invisible rivers of air, descending after eternity into the faint outline of her target. Her breath came slow, half out, hold stillness. She squeezed. The recoil hit her shoulder like a hammer, this roar echoing off valley walls. Time fractured. 4.8 seconds. Her eyes tracked the bullet's invisible flight, waiting, waiting, waiting. Impact. The silhouette jerked as snow burst in a fine spray around it. Then the electronic scoring system lit green. Hit. Confirmed. A sound rose behind her, applause, exclamations, disbelief. International observers leaned forward, whispering into headsets, confirming what she already knew. She had done it. She had pushed a bullet farther than any woman, any soldier, any human in recorded history under observation. But she didn't smile, didn't even exhale relief, because it wasn't over. Victor was still waiting. She rolled to the side, wiped sweat from her brow despite the cold. Her chest heaved as though she'd just sprinted miles. She turned her head, watching him move to the line. His preparation looked almost casual, rifle set down with quiet precision, a glance at the target, a few adjustments. Then he lowered himself into position, and the world seemed to fold around him. Rachel's pulse hammered harder than when she had fired her own shot. Victor closed his eyes for a moment, prayer, maybe, or just stillness, and then his finger touched the trigger. The shot cracked, echoes rolled like thunder. 4.8 seconds. Rachel's heart pounded with each beat, each second dragging eternity into the snow. She wanted to look away, to not watch, but she couldn't. Impact. The measuring system blinked red, then green, then red again. Officials leaned in, murmuring, recalibrating. Finally, confirmation, dead center. Perfect. The valley went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the Alps themselves had been stunned into stillness. Rachel's mouth went dry. She had done the impossible, and he had done more. Around them, the officials began debating, recording, scrambling for statements. Cameras whirred, voices rose, but Rachel heard none of it. She only saw Victor, standing, brushing snow from his jacket with calm dignity. He looked across the range at her. For the first time he smiled, faint, respectful, almost sad. It was not the smile of a man who mocked. It was the smile of someone who understood what it had cost her to stand there, to fight, to break herself for that one shot. She looked away first, not out of shame, but because she couldn't bear the weight of it. In that moment, Rachel realized something that cut deeper than failure or pride. This competition was never truly about her. It was about nations, intelligence, power. She was a soldier, yes, but also a symbol, a weapon dressed in flesh. And Victor, he was the same. As applause swelled again and officials swarmed them both, Rachel whispered to herself, too quiet for anyone to hear. God help us all. What happens after the cheering fades? Sarah Martinez thought about that often in the weeks following her victory over Staff Sergeant. One day she was a recruit fighting for respect. The next she was a name whispered across the Corps. Not because of medals, not because of combat, but because she had done the unthinkable. And now people wanted to know what to do with her. Captain hadn't been exaggerating. Calls came from other commands, curious inquiries cloaked in military formality but pulsing with the same question. Is she real? The answer came swiftly, orders. Sarah was reassigned, not to a unit, not to deployment, to a program classified Virginia. The words felt strange even as she read them. This wasn't what she'd enlisted for. She'd imagined battlefields, rifles, squads depending on her. Instead, she found herself boarding a plane east, leaving California behind, wondering if she was being hidden or elevated. The facility in Virginia didn't look like much from the outside. A cluster of concrete buildings tucked behind fences and trees. Inside, though, it felt different. A laboratory mixed with a training hall, Marines sparring on mats, scientists scribbling notes, instructors debating biomechanics beside whiteboards covered in diagrams. And Sarah, barely 22, thrust into the middle of it. The mission was clear: develop combat techniques for Marines who didn't fit the mold. Smaller frames, injuries, limitations, people the Corps often overlooked. Sarah looked around at her new peers. Combat veterans with scars she couldn't imagine. Martial arts experts flown in from across the globe. Weapons specialists tinkering with modified gear. And then there was her, the recruit who had gone viral across bases for dropping giants. Her first instinct was doubt. What am I doing here? But then she met her students. Private Lisa, even smaller than Sarah, 5 feet tall, her determination sharp enough to cut steel. A brilliant mind, but her instructors back home had written her off as too fragile for combat. Corporal, broad-shouldered, eyes haunted, his left arm ending in a stump just above the elbow. An IED in Afghanistan had nearly killed him. The Corps had told him his fighting days were done. There were others, each carrying their own form of dismissal, too small, too weak, too broken. Sarah saw herself in all of them. Training began awkwardly. She wasn't used to being the teacher, but as days stretched into weeks, something shifted. She remembered standing by the bag, correcting her footwork. She remembered her father's quiet pride when she had finally made him believe. She channeled all of it. To Lisa, she taught speed as weapon. To leverage and adaptation. She showed them that strength wasn't about muscle, it was about how you used what you had. Size is a fact, she told them one evening, sweat dripping, her knuckles raw from sparring. But facts don't decide fights, choices do. The program's scientists took notes, fascinated. They measured torque, velocity, pressure points. Sarah didn't think in numbers. She thought in instincts. But slowly, they turned her instincts into a curriculum. Then came the test. A demonstration. 6 opponents at once. Experienced Marines briefed not to underestimate her. The scenario was simple: survive. Sarah stepped into the circle. 6 pairs of eyes fixed on her, waiting. Her chest tightened, not from fear of losing, but from fear of what it meant if she won. The whistle blew. They attacked in waves, 2 at first rushing to trap her. Sarah moved fast, unpredictable, a slip, a joint lock, a throw, 1 down, a pivot, an elbow strike to a solar plexus, 2 down. The remaining 4 circled. They'd seen what happened to the first wave. Now they moved cautiously, coordinated. Sarah adapted. She grabbed one, used his bulk as shield, redirected momentum into chaos. Another dropped, gasping for breath. Her world shrank to motion, instinct, the thud of bodies against mats. Within minutes, only one remained. Staff Sergeant Williams, 20 years of service. Seasoned, cautious. He advanced slowly, no wasted movement. The final exchange was sharp, brutal, brief. A slip, a chokehold, a tap. Silence. The generals watching didn't clap. They didn't need to. Their faces said enough. Shock, recognition, maybe even fear. General, who had been skeptical of the program, approached afterward. His voice carried weight. Marine Martinez, I came expecting a gimmick. What I saw was a revolution. This needs to go corps-wide. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. Outwardly she stood tall. Inwardly she trembled. Because she had just changed something bigger than herself. The program exploded overnight. Training modules built from her methods. Techniques taught to instructors across bases. She was promoted early, sent overseas to demonstrate to Allied forces. Suddenly, she wasn't just Sarah. She was the proof. The girl who had once written letters to her mother about being ignored now found herself on podiums, in front of cameras, asked to explain things she'd only ever felt in her bones. And she hated it. Not the teaching, not the training, the symbol. Symbols didn't bleed. Symbols didn't doubt. Symbols didn't lie awake at night wondering if their body would fail them. But Sarah did. Every time she walked into a gym and recruits straightened at the sight of her. Every time reporters scribbled her words like scripture. Every time generals nodded as if she carried the corps on her shoulders. The weight pressed heavier. One evening, long after lights out, she sat alone on the mat, staring at her reflection in the mirrored wall. Her bruises glowed purple under the fluorescent hum. She whispered, barely audible, I never wanted this. But the silence gave no answer. Because once you become a symbol, you don't get to choose. What happens after the echo fades, when history has already been written in gunpowder and silence? Rachel asked herself that as she sat in the debriefing chamber hours after the final shot. The Swiss Alps had gone quiet again, but inside the steel walls of the underground complex, noise pressed from all sides, shuffling papers, the murmur of interpreters, the low growl of brass debating what the results meant. She sat alone at the long table, her rifle packed away, her hands clasped in front of her like a soldier waiting judgment. Every muscle in her body ached, but her mind refused rest. The image kept returning, unbidden, like a wound she couldn't stop pressing. Victor's bullet tearing dead center at 3,847 meters. Her shot had been history. His had been something beyond it. Director Mitchell entered, his face carved with fatigue. He set a folder down in front of her without ceremony. "Colonel Blackwood, you understand what you accomplished today." Rachel raised her eyes. "I also understand what he accomplished." Mitchell nodded once. "Both matter, but for different reasons." He slid the folder toward her. She opened it and found analysis already: wind charts, pressure logs, ballistic traces. Her own shot was broken down in detail, calculations matching her corrections, validation of her methods. But Victor looked different. His data showed margins so tight, so consistent, that even the algorithms flagged them as improbable. Rachel leaned back. "So what's the verdict, superhuman or cheating?" Mitchell's jaw tightened. "We don't know yet. What we do know is this: he knew things he shouldn't. His corrections aligned with methods classified at levels he had no access to. That tells me there's been a leak." The word struck harder this time. Leak, breach, betrayal. She had suspected it, but hearing it from Mitchell hardened the suspicion into something heavier. Her voice came low. "Someone fed him my methods." Mitchell didn't answer directly. Instead, he closed the folder. "I'll be blunt, Colonel, this competition wasn't about pride. It was about data. The Russians used you as a test subject, and he was their instrument. Now we need to know how far their reach goes." Rachel's stomach turned. She had always known she was being watched. Every sniper of her caliber lived with that shadow. But the idea that her very techniques, her secrets born in Montana snow and combat deserts, had been studied and stolen, that cut deeper than any defeat. That night the officials hosted a formal dinner, a theater of diplomacy. Swiss hosts toasted neutrality, Russian dignitaries praised international cooperation, American generals spoke of shared respect. Rachel sat through it like stone, sipping water, listening to the hollow ring of words. Across the table, Victor looked perfectly composed. He raised his glass when the toast was called, but his eyes never left hers. Later, when the hall emptied and the clatter of cutlery faded into silence, Rachel found herself standing alone on the balcony overlooking the valley. The cold bit her face, but she welcomed it. She needed something real after so many layers of performance. "Colonel." The voice was calm, accented but clear. She turned. Victor stood a few steps away, hands folded behind his back. No guards, no entourage, just him. Rachel stiffened. "Here to celebrate." He shook his head. "No, to speak." She hesitated, then gestured slightly. "Go on." Victor stepped closer, but not threateningly. His expression was serious, almost weary. "I owe you honesty. My performance today, it was not only mine. I had access to information about you, about your methods." Rachel's chest tightened. "So you admit it?" He nodded once. "Yes, your government will suspect breach. They are right to. My government wanted to understand you, Colonel, to measure you. I was the vessel." Her fists clenched at her sides. Rage surged, but beneath it was something stranger. Relief. To hear it confirmed, to know she hadn't been imagining. "Why tell me this?" she asked. "Because respect demands it." His pale eyes softened just slightly. "You should know. The information I received told me what to expect, but it did not prepare me for how you adapted. You fought the wind, the altitude, the pressure. You proved something my files did not show, that your instinct, your resilience, goes beyond calculation." Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "Is that supposed to make me feel better, that I lost fair and square even though you cheated?" Victor didn't flinch. "You did not lose. You revealed strength my government did not predict, that is, more valuable than victory." For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the whistling of alpine wind. Rachel's anger dulled, though it didn't disappear. She studied him, the soldier who had just broken her record, the man who had become her rival and mirror. She wanted to hate him, but instead she felt something more complicated. Recognition. Because beneath flags and governments they were the same breed, forged in silence, defined by stillness, condemned to prove themselves with every pull of a trigger. Victor inclined his head. "For what it is worth, Colonel, I respect you, more than any opponent I have faced." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the cold. Rachel stood there long after, breath fogging the night air, staring into the black expanse of the valley. For the first time since this began, she realized the duel was not over. Not truly. Because the real battle was no longer across a rifle's scope. It was inside intelligence rooms, in whispered corridors, in the question of how far her secrets had been compromised, and whether she could ever trust her own shadow again. What happens when the world cheers your victory, but you feel only the weight of loss? Rachel carried that question with her on the flight back to Washington. The C-17 transport hummed with the low drone of engines, but the sound couldn't drown out the replay in her mind. The recoil, the long silence of flight her hit confirmed. Then his. Dead center. Perfect. Every congratulation she received felt like sand slipping through her fingers. Generals shook her hand. Analysts praised her discipline. The press called it a triumph for America, a validation of Western doctrine. But Rachel knew the truth. She had broken herself for that one shot, and he had made it look effortless. She stared out the window at endless clouds, wondering if Victor was on his own flight, feeling the same hollow ache. Or did he sleep soundly, unburdened by questions, knowing he had carried the day? When she landed, the Pentagon swallowed her whole. Endless meetings, classified briefings, every frame of the duel dissected by ballistics experts, every variable run through models. She sat in silence as her own government turned her into data points, breathing rate, shot timing, trajectory variance, her humanity stripped into graphs. In one closed-door session, Director Mitchell spoke bluntly. "Colonel's methods indicate access to classified materials. We don't yet know the source of the breach, but your participation confirmed what we needed. Russian doctrine has studied our techniques closely. You gave us proof." Rachel's hands tightened around the armrests. Proof. That was what she was now, a test subject, a case study. "And what about him?" she asked quietly. Mitchell glanced at her. "Is an asset for their side. You don't need to carry him with you. Focus on what we can learn from this." But she did carry him. His pale eyes, his calm voice on the balcony when he admitted the truth. Respect demands honesty. The strange dignity in his confession haunted her more than his perfect shot. Days blurred. Sleep came rarely, broken by dreams of bullets arcing through endless sky, of targets vanishing just before impact. In the daylight, she walked the corridors of the Pentagon like a ghost, answering questions but never speaking her own. One evening, Dr. Harrison found her alone in a war room, staring at a blown-up image of the valley where it had all happened. "You're not eating," Harrison said softly. Rachel didn't look away from the image. "Do you know what it's like to be turned into a benchmark? Every meeting, they're not talking to me, they're talking about me. I'm just numbers on a chart now." "You're more than numbers," Harrison said, "but right now they need what you learned." Rachel finally turned. Her eyes were hollow. "What if what I learned is that I'm not enough?" Harrison stepped closer, her voice firm. "You faced the best in the world. You didn't break. That's more than enough." Rachel wanted to believe her. She didn't. Weeks passed. She tried returning to normal routines, running, training, recalibrating rifles in the armory, but nothing felt normal anymore. Each time she lifted a rifle to her shoulder, she felt his shadow beside her. She saw the way he had fired with such ease, as though the distance was nothing. One night, alone in her apartment, she laid her across the table and stared at it under the dim light. Her hands hovered over the scope. For the first time in years, she wondered if the weapon had mastered her instead of the other way around. Her phone buzzed, a classified message. She hesitated, then opened it. The DIA was summoning her again. Not to the Pentagon this time, but to a smaller, darker building she hadn't entered in years. Inside, the walls were lined with soundproofing and the air smelled faintly of metal. Mitchell was there, along with a handful of analysts. On the screen behind him glowed images not of Switzerland but of Russia, snowbound facilities, training grounds, satellite shots of figures practicing in forests. Colonel, Mitchell said, wasn't acting alone. Our latest intel indicates his unit has been developing hybrid techniques, partly from their own doctrine, partly from what they've stolen from ours. You helped us identify that gap. Now we need to close it. Rachel's stomach nodded. You want me to train against ghosts? Mitchell shook his head. Not against, with. We want to incorporate what you learned into our own programs, adapt before they adapt further. Rachel swallowed hard. So I'm not just a sniper anymore, I'm a laboratory. No, Mitchell said, his voice low. You're the edge. She left the building long after midnight, the city lights of Washington glowing like faint constellations in the distance. The weight of the words clung to her. The edge. A thin line between safety and collapse, between pride and paranoia. As she walked the empty street, she realized the duel with Victor hadn't ended in Switzerland. It was still happening, every day, in every decision, in every secret stolen or guarded. She stopped under a streetlight, breath clouding the cold air, and whispered to herself, "You didn't break then, you won't break now." But deep down, she knew the line she walked was razor-thin, and one wrong step could cut her open. What does it cost a soldier when the mission is no longer survival, but silence? Rachel felt that cost in every step she took through the shadow corridors of intelligence briefings. They no longer spoke to her about training or competition. Instead, the language shifted, operational terms, black projects, threat analysis. They wanted her to become not just a soldier but a symbol, a firewall against an enemy who already knew too much. Her days bled into simulations, firing ranges built in controlled environments, wind tunnels that mimicked alpine currents, ballistic labs where scientists measured every breath she took. Cameras tracked her eye movement as she calculated targets. Electrodes monitored her pulse when she fired under pressure. And yet, in the quiet between tests, she couldn't stop hearing his voice. Respect demands honesty. Victor's confession haunted her more than his perfect shot. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't taunted. He had admitted, almost with shame, that his edge came from stolen knowledge. And in that strange admission, he had given her something unexpected: validation. But why? Why confess to her at all? The question burned as she stood in a glass office one evening, watching the sun set over the Potomac. Washington glowed gold, but she felt nothing of its beauty. Director Mitchell entered, holding another classified folder. "We've intercepted new chatter," he said. "S unit is active again. Syria, eastern Ukraine, the Arctic. They're deploying long-range shooters in ways we haven't seen before. And Colonel," his voice dropped lower, "we believe himself may be commanding them." Rachel's chest tightened. Commanding or hunting? Mitchell didn't answer. He didn't need to. Later that night, unable to sleep, she walked the quiet streets near her apartment. The city buzzed faintly in the distance, but here it was hushed, shadows stretching long under pale. She found herself staring at the reflection in a shop window, a woman in uniform, face drawn, eyes older than her years. "What are you becoming?" The reflection didn't answer. Weeks later, she was deployed, not to combat but to observe. Switzerland had made her name global, and now she was paraded before allies as proof of American precision. NATO workshops, classified briefings. She stood in cold ranges across Europe, demonstrating methods she had once guarded as sacred secrets. But every time she spoke, she wondered, was Victor watching? Was he hearing her voice through some intercepted channel, her adjustments the way he had her record? One night in Germany, after a long day of demonstrations, she received a coded envelope. No return mark, no signature. Inside, a single sheet of paper, handwritten in neat Cyrillic. She couldn't read it fully, but the translator confirmed later. Sometimes the rifle is not the weapon, sometimes the shooter is. No name, no signature, but she knew. Victor. Her hands trembled as she folded the note again. Why send it? To taunt, to warn, or to reach out? The questions gnawed at her during long flights home, during nights staring at ceilings. She thought of his pale eyes, the calm way he had looked at her after his perfect shot, not as a conqueror, but as something else. An equal. One evening, Dr. Harrison pressed her gently during a session. You talk about him often, not with anger, with curiosity. Why? Rachel hesitated. Because he's the only one who understands. Understands what? What it takes, she whispered. What it costs to live at the edge of human capability, to break yourself for a single shot. The words hung in the air like confession. In the months that followed, Rachel became sharper. Her techniques improved as she integrated fragments of what she had seen from Victor. Environmental intuition, micro-adjustments, gut over math. She told herself it was necessary, that to defeat him she had to learn from him. But deep down, she knew it was more than strategy. It was obsession. One night, after another grueling round of simulations, she found herself staring at a classified dossier stamped Ghost of Siberia. She traced her finger over his photo, remembering the balcony in Switzerland, the honesty in his voice. She whispered to the empty room, "Why me?" The silence gave no answer. But she knew. It was because they were the same. Mirrors split by borders, by governments, by loyalties neither of them had chosen. Rachel lay awake until dawn, the city outside her window still and dark. And as the first light broke over Washington, she made herself a promise. If she ever faced Victor again, it would not be under flags or protocols. It would be between two human beings, stripped of secrets, stripped of orders. Because somewhere in the shadows between rivalry and respect, something deeper was waiting. And Rachel wasn't sure yet if it was salvation or destruction. What remains when the records are broken, the headlines fade, and only silence is left? For Rachel, it was the silence that became the heaviest burden. Months after Switzerland, the world had moved on. Journalists stopped calling. The record was logged in sterile reports, tucked away in archives that would gather dust. But Rachel lived with it every night. The moment her bullet struck, the moment his bullet struck truer. History's echo would not let her go. She kept training, kept lecturing, kept answering to the same officials who saw her less as a soldier and more as a case study. But the truth was simpler, sharper. She was tired. And yet, one evening in early autumn, fatigue gave way to something unexpected. A call came through her secure line, a voice she recognized instantly, calm, low, Russian. Colonel Blackwood. Her breath caught. The silence that followed stretched too long, filled only by the faint static of distance. Then he spoke again. We are not enemies, you and I, not truly, are we? Her pulse hammered. That depends on what you're after. A conversation, he said simply. No flags, no observers, just truth. Rachel hesitated. Every instinct screamed trap. But another voice, quieter, deeper, whispered something else. The same voice that had carried her through 3,847 meters of chaos. Listen. So she listened. That night outside Geneva, she met him again. No uniforms, no medals, no rifles. Just two people sitting across a wooden table in a room that smelled faintly of dust and old stone. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Victor broke the silence. You should know, I did not want that competition. It was forced upon me. A stage for governments, not for us. Rachel studied him, searching for deception. But his eyes held the same steadiness she remembered. And yet, she said quietly, you won. He shook his head. No, I performed. Winning was never mine. It belonged to those who used me. The word struck deep, because she realized with sudden clarity that they were both prisoners of the same machine, she to her flag, he to his, two instruments calibrated by others aimed at each other for spectacle. Rachel leaned back, exhaling slowly. So what now? Another duel, another test. Victor's expression softened. No, I came to tell you this. What you did at that range under those conditions was beyond anything I expected. I had your methods, yes, but what I saw was you. Not your government, not your files, you. Her throat tightened. She had braced for rivalry, for insult, even for veiled threats. But respect, genuine human respect, that was harder to accept. And what am I supposed to do with that? She asked. He looked down at his hands, pale in the dim light. Carry it the way I will carry yours. Silence again, but this time it felt less like a wall, more like a bridge. When they parted, there were no handshakes, no promises, just a nod, an unspoken truth. They would likely never meet again. And maybe that was for the best, because some rivalries weren't meant to end in resolution. They were meant to linger, to shape, to haunt. Weeks later, back in Washington, Rachel sat in her office late at night, the city spread out in lights below. On her desk lay two things: the ballistic chart from her record shot and the note he had once sent. Sometimes the rifle is not the weapon. Sometimes the shooter is. She stared at them for a long time, then closed her eyes. She thought of Montana, of her father's voice on a winter ridge. Stillness inside you, Rachel. That's where the shot begins. She thought of Afghanistan, of hostages saved by bullets no one else believed she could fire. She thought of Switzerland, of Victor's pale eyes, his perfect shot, and his quiet confession. And finally, she thought of now, of herself, stripped of titles, stripped of medals, just a woman who had walked to the edge of human ability and not broken. A faint smile touched her lips, not of pride but of peace. Because she realized something Victor had forced her to face. The record was never the point. The duel was never the point. It was the stillness, the resilience, the willingness to step into impossible silence and act. Rachel turned off the desk lamp, leaving the office in darkness. She stood at the window, watching the city breathe below, and whispered words only for herself. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And with that, she finally let the silence settle, not as a burden, but as a companion.